Almost 30 years ago, Scream blew audiences' minds by deconstructing the slasher genre. Does it have the same effect watching it for the first time in 2024? Let's talk about Scream.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are back, the Eye of the Storm podcast. We're just going to get straight into it. Danny G, can you let the people know what this series is?
So this is Have You Seen, in which we talk about a movie that some of us know well and others have just seen for the first time. This week we are talking about Scream from 1996, which at the time revolutionized the horror and slasher genre. It follows the story of this serial killer who is killing high schoolers in this small Californian town. So I've seen this movie a bunch of times over the years, but it's never really been one of my top franchises or anything. But I must have seen it 4 or 5 times over the years. But the two of you have just seen it for the first time, right? So what were your takeaways from Scream?
I will say this was a fun ride, which felt familiar, mainly just due to get a bit of like nostalgia of like kind of like late 90s, sort of early 2000s type of movie. Sort of like it had that sort of feel or familiar sort of kind of like tone to it. I thought like it was like, well paced, really well acted as well by sort of all the different performers. Yeah, it kept me guessing. I will say it kept me guessing as to who it possibly could be. And every time I thought that I had like a solid person who I thought it was, it just turned out to be completely wrong. So even though it ended up being the first person I predicted it would be, but it kind of kept me guessing and maybe a few good red herrings in there. So overall, a very enjoyable, just kind of like a fun, sort of, popcorny type of movie. Nothing to take too serious. Something to kind of just like watch and just like, feel kind of cozy watching, to be honest. Which is weird to say about a serial killer movie.
For me, I thought pretty much it was like, I was going to say pretty much what Hervey said about popcorn movie. I felt like it was like a junk movie, as in like it was like junk food. It's something that you shouldn't indulge in a lot, but when you do indulge in it, it's very fun. It's very tasty and very entertaining. Well, what doesn't really make sense, but hopefully you understand what the hell I was trying to say. But yeah, it was fun. It was fun. I enjoyed the whole like the playing on the whole horror genre and how pretty much the actors, like pretty much the characters, were like following the rules and the influences of a horror movie. So I think overall I had a fun time. It's definitely not a film which is going in like my top 10 horror movie lists of all time. But this is a slasher. It's like a slasher. Okay, well, you know what? In terms of slashers, I'd probably say it is top 10 in terms of slashers. It's like a subgenre of horror. That is a subgenre of horror. But yeah, so I'd say top 10 slashers of all time for me so far. It was fun. Of course, there's a few problems there, but at the end of the day, I think this was just meant to be like a fun movie. It wasn't supposed to be like a serious type of movie because I've seen other Scream movies. I just haven't seen this one. So like when I watched this, I was like, okay, I knew what I was gonna get, but like watching it here, it just felt like it was fun. It was a fun watch. So things I liked, which we'll get into later.
So this series is mostly about what is it like when somebody watches your favorite movie for the first time. And the thing about Scream is that it had a huge effect when it came out at the time, but it was very specifically a commentary on what was going on in movies at the time, right? So it came out in the mid-90s, came out like on the tail end of a decade where horror had grown kind of stale and tired, and there were a lot of mediocre sequels of slashers. And if you've seen like the later sequels of big franchises like Halloween or Friday the 13th, you can see them running out of steam, right? And if you have a decade of that and then Scream comes out, I think that kind of explains why it has this legendary status, or that goes a lot towards explaining that. But it's been 30 years since then, right? Horror has moved on, movies have moved on, the culture has moved on. Can you relate to that reaction at all watching this in 2024?
I can relate to kind of a lot of what they were saying about sort of how tropey horror can be sometimes, in terms of, the type of like characters you have in it, sort of like the sinners and then sort of like the not sinners and this and the other, and like sort of it's quite often formulaic as to sort of who's expected to be killed in the movie and who's sort of kind of like likely to survive the movie. So I feel like in that sense, it's still kind of like relevant in sort of the message it was trying to put out. Of course, you've got like different types of horrors and things that have changed, but in its sort of kind of lane or in its field, it does feel like a lot of what the message was in that still stands to this day, because there's a lot of movies that you can say are sort of quite predictable in sort of how they are sort of set to play out, essentially.
Okay, but what was the purpose of this film then? Was it just to take the piss? Because if it was just to take the piss, then what is this film's purpose? Is it to take the piss out of horror movies, or just is its selling point that it's kind of like showing the tropes and the cliches of like horror movies?
So part of it is satire, right? By making fun, like I don't know that this movie makes fun exactly, but it kind of plays with these tropes, and it kind of I think we could go into that, especially when we get to the discussion of the villain and the big reveal at the end especially about the motive. But it just plays with audience expectations, right? So one aspect of this is that the opening sequence has like this teenager be killed by Ghostface, right? In her home, and there's this whole he's toying with her, he's scaring her over the phone by talking to her about he's going to kill her, and about like reminding her of scary movies and stuff like that, right? But that actress was Drew Barrymore, who was huge in the early 90s, right? And the initial marketing of the movie essentially had her on all the posters. So if you went into this watching this in 96, you were expecting that she would be the star. Essentially that she would be the Neve Campbell character. But then she dies in the first 5 minutes. So that's an example of how the movie kind of plays with both genre expectations as well as expectations of how movies work, right? Like that what trailers tell you and how they're structured and what you can assume about like how they're made and like the different characters and stuff like that, right? So that's an example of what the satire consists of. So I wouldn't say it's just taking the piss, and it's not just making fun. It's playing with audience expectations, and essentially the point of the opening sequence, for instance, is to kind of lure the audience into making an assumption about what's going on and then just doing the opposite, but in a way that makes sense and that still works on its own, right? Like it's not like this is just a farce or anything like that. It's still a very effective story, a very effective movie. But also, if you go into it with your standard expectations of what these movies are like, you're going to be surprised, right? And so it's like this arms race between the audience and the movie in terms of trying to kind of figure each other out and trying to anticipate each other's next steps and stuff like that. So that's the satire of Scream.
Okay, I'm trying to think of the horror movies now and to see if any films are made in that way in terms of like, of course there's a mystery, there's always like mystery horror movies in terms of like who the actual killer is, but in terms of the way that this film was done, it felt like watching a crime horror movie in a way, like as in like the audience was the investigators trying to figure out, okay, who the hell is the actual killer, and then when you're actually faced with the killer, you're not knowing if that's the actual killer or not in terms of So that was interesting. And also the art of covering your tracks as well, the way that was kind of like executed in this film, that was interesting too. So it's definitely something that I found unique about this film, was those 2 points in comparison to like any other horror movie that I've seen. So I'd say that it was like, when you look at it from face value, it's just another horror, like another slasher movie. But then as we actually delve into it and you're like, okay, you know what? They're actually doing this. Like they're not taking the piss, but it's like you said, the satire and etc. So it's like, okay, this is actually deeper than the way that it's presented in a way. And you are right, there was like that whole surprise and shock value when it comes to the movie as well. I didn't know that the main, like the actor in the first 5 minutes, I didn't know she was actually the star. So that's actually surprising. I can imagine
the marketing presented her as the star.
Yeah.
And she's exactly the kind of person who would be the star, like in that kind of movie.
Yeah.
So I actually think the genius of this movie goes a little bit further, which is that it does all of these things, right? It discusses it plays with audience expectations and genre tropes and structure and all of these things, but it also is just a really good slasher, right? So I actually watched Scream before I watched other slasher movies, So about a year ago, I kind of went through the exercise of watching Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, pretty much the entire franchises in about 2 months, which I wouldn't recommend, but I kind of just want, like, I had heard mixed things about them. Like, some of them are classics, some of them are infamous for being pretty terrible. Mostly because they, much like today's franchises, if a movie works, it gets a sequel, and they keep making sequels until it stops working, and then as a result, people remember how the franchise ended as opposed to how it started, right? So if a franchise gets run into the ground, it's like today's Star Wars, right? Like it starts out with high acclaim, and then they make another one, and each one is a little bit worse, and then people remember the bad ones more than the good ones after a while, right? And slasher movies were kind of like this throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, from everything I've heard. And so if you just watch, like, we watched the first Halloween, right? And you guys were, I think, a bit lukewarm about it. And that's a good one, right? Like if you watch the entire franchise, some of them are better than others, but a lot of them were kind of made because the last one made money. And they just keep trying to kind of drag out the premise for another movie until it stops working, essentially. And if you've just gone through a decade of this and then something like this comes along, it's just a good slasher. So the point I was already trying to make is I watched Scream first, and then I watched these classics, and the classics were really underwhelming because of that. Because actually, I think this is one of the best slashers, just in terms of how it flows, the characters, the kills, the mystery of who the killer is. All of those things work better than in your average slasher. And then on top of that, it's also a satire of not just slasher movies. It plays with the idea of movies and how audiences engage with movies, and it's doing all of these things at the same time. But if you don't have an eye for that, if that's not what you're there for, you are still getting a really good slasher movie, right? And then if you watch it again, you maybe notice more and more and so on. But like this is not just a movie for film nerds to kind of agree with each other how genius it is, right? This is actually just a good movie first, and then it builds the other layers on top.
What made this movie a little bit more satisfying, especially sort of compared to Halloween, was, like you said, was that mystery and having that mystery resolved. And you can kind of sort of on first watch, there's like things mentioned, and there's like obviously like pieces put in play, such as her mother sort of being killed the year before, and sort of this journalist having sort of written a book because she thinks that the man that sort of killed her is innocent, this and the other. So there's like nice little pieces that are being added.
It might just be that she wrote that she wrote that book because it would sell a lot of copies. It's not entirely clear, right? She's probably sincere, but the media circus is an aspect of the story as well, right?
Yeah, and you can kind of tell. You can kind of tell that she's all about sort of kind of like getting the big story and sort of putting sort of the news out there. So definitely not absolved of that. But yeah, it was definitely good, even though it was kind of done in sort of a bit of an exposition dump at the sort of end of the movie. It was good to get an understanding as to why this was happening. And one of my questions is if it was related to her mother, and her mother sort of kind of being a bit promiscuous and sort of causing Billy Loomis's character's sort of mother to leave. Why did he kill everyone else? Like, why did he kill Drew Barrymore's character at the start of the movie? Was just one of the questions I had. And I can get, I think what they mentioned was like, during that scene was about having, looking for a motive or looking for a reason, and sometimes people can just be evil. And I feel like they probably went a little bit psychotic and were just in a bit of a kill, they had this like maybe idea of killing off Neve Campbell's character. I can't remember what she was called, and then just went into a bit of a killing frenzy just before that. Was kind of how I maybe took it away. But I don't know if there's any additional context as to why other people had to die in this.
Yeah. I feel like there was actually a reason behind that. I think they wanted to keep the fear in the town. That continuous torment, and always like, especially because the fear was so close to, what's the main actress's name again?
Sydney is the character.
Sid. So I feel like, because it was close to home, because like the murders were happening close to home. So it was one of them. I think it's like they were trying to make sure to know that wherever she's going in town, she's never safe, because pretty much anyone can get. I remember there was a news report, a black news report, where she was reporting that there was 2 deaths. Who's next? So I thought, okay, that kind of tells me that even though they were psychotic, the killers were psychotic, and I think it was it was a build on to just that continuous torment. I feel like there was a reason behind it, and that reason was Sid pretty much just killing anyone around her vicinity to make her continuously feel unsafe.
So in our Halloween discussion, we talked about Michael Myers and about how he's kind of a lame villain a little bit, if you look at it from the perspective of motivation and why is this happening and so on, right? And I think this movie kind of comments on that, where part of it is the in-character motivation, right, of going after Sydney because of like punishing her for the sins of her mother and stuff like that. But also it's a commentary on slasher villains and their motives, where we want them to have a motive because it feels unsatisfying if they don't. But we don't really care. We kind of just want to see them kill people, right? Like the big horror icons, like Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th and Michael Myers from Halloween, don't really have motives. They just kill, right? Like different movies have had different takes on this, and in some versions there's more for motivation, and sometimes there's less of motivation. But ultimately, they are faceless monsters who kill, and it feels unsatisfying, right? But then we get, in Scream, we not only get one villain with a motivation, we get two, right? One of them says, I did this for personal reason. I want revenge. Your mother destroyed my family and I can't punish her, so I'm going to punish you. Which is like a textbook motivation for a villain, right? Like family, revenge, like these are very familiar tropes as far as character motivations go, right? And then the other villain says, I watch too many movies. What do you want? Right? Kind of, more or less. Like he ridicules the idea of there even being a motivation, right? And he seemingly does it just for the thrill or because he's just crazy, or like he's the kind of Michael Myers version of some people are just evil.
Peer pressure as well. Then you mentioned about something kind of like peer pressure. There was also a comment about him being a bit of a lapdog to Billy Loomis's character in this as well. So he just kind of felt like he was just kind of dragged along on this ride.
I remember it as him kind of throwing peer pressure into the ring. Just why we're at it, why not also peer pressure kind of thing. Like I viewed it as this dichotomy of one of the villains has this serious personal motivation and the other one has no motivation and even ridicules the idea of a motivation. And we don't really know which one is true, right? Yeah. They both make an equal amount of sense, and that we don't, and neither is really satisfying, I thought. Like for me, every time I watch Scream, like the ending is kind of the least interesting part because it's just this big exposition dump of this is why this is happening, and neither version is really terribly interesting, at least to me. So that's kind of how I take it. In my head, I kind of put it as it's kind of making fun of the idea of a villain having to have a motivation in order to be a compelling villain. Because we don't watch Halloween movies because Michael Myers is such an interesting character, or because the teenagers he's going after are so interesting. Same for pretty much any other slasher movie. We watch them, if we like them, we probably like them because the kills are fun. And that's ultimately, if we're honest, that's why we watch them, right?
Was that not part of the commentary in this movie as well about sort of almost the desensitization of sort of these slasher movies and its effect on sort of people? Because obviously a lot of the teens were like sort of super well versed in sort of a lot of these like slasher movies in this, and there was like several points where they were kind of making light of some of the killings that were happening. Of course, you had like the two boys that had the scream mask running through the school. There was also when they were at the party and it said about the principal that was murdered, and everyone kind of like jumped up all excited to go and sort of kind of see what happened as well. So that's sort of one thing I did take away from this was, you know, whether it was sort of making a point to say, whether it was, you know, making a point to say, you know, these movies are bad for sort of, you know, people in terms of like making them a little bit more impressionable to kind of go out and sort of do these things, or where do you see it fit in sort of the scale of the argument? Do you think it was just kind of making a point just to make a point, or sort of, do you think there was more to it? There was more kind of like thought behind the sort of message that they wanted to put out there, with sort of people being a little bit more relaxed and sort of carefree about the things that were happening in the community?
I'm actually not sure that the movie has a message when it comes to that. I think it just shows people not taking this seriously, because for them, fact and fiction have kind of blurred. Like they watch too many movies, or they think everything is a joke, or the media creates this big circus, like while the crisis is going on, right? While the killer is still out there, and they kind of freely blend fact and fiction, and they turn fact into into fiction and fiction into fact and so on, right? So I think it just presents a situation in which all of this stuff is kind of mixed up, and it ultimately gets people killed, right? Because like if people really just took this seriously and went into real crisis mode, not as many people would have died, and the killers would have been caught quicker probably, right? So I'm not sure, like watching this movie, I wasn't sure that the movie was actually telling me what the answer was. It was more like toying with the idea and showing us different aspects of it. And I think that is actually more effective in terms of making us think about it, right? If it just tells you what to think, there's no real thought process going on. But if it just shows us like 5 different sides to the issue, I think that makes you think more. And I think that's what this is doing.
Kind of go back to what you guys were saying about the motivation. I thought it was pretty, like, of course it was basic, but I thought it was pretty neat because that moment there, it revealed to Sid that her mother was a freaky one. So I was like, even when he said it, I was like, damn. I swear, I wish I was like, oh, damn, that makes sense. But it doesn't make sense, but it makes sense. You know what I'm saying? Because like he's already a psychopath. So it makes sense because obviously the influence
how is this a real motive for murder?
Well, no, that's what I'm saying. Well, you have to take into consideration their influence on horror movies already. So they've already been poisoned by horror movies. So a mixture of that, and you got the mixture of his father. Because he even had a scene with Sid where he was talking about how his mother left him. Like even that moment there when he was pretty much trying to describe why Sid wouldn't, like, you know, technically sleep with him. Like that's what he's pretty much trying to say, well, you know. So his reasoning there, that kind of showed to me that this guy, he's off his rocker because he's talking about how I miss my girlfriend, and then he was saying and he was trying to say to her, oh, your mom died a year ago, get over it, and tried to compare it with his mother leaving. And in that moment, I said, yeah, this guy is a dodgy guy already. So already we saw like aspects of this guy not really being all right in the head, and obviously like so what I'm trying to pretty much say is like the influence of horror movies and his traumatic experience with his mother leaving due to Sydney's mother doing what she did with his father, a mixture of that creates a killer. So even though it is ridiculous and an over exaggeration, slashes are over exaggerations and they are ridiculous. So I don't really think we should be looking too much into it and be, you know what I'm saying? I think we should just kind of take it for what it is. And it was, for me, I thought like it was neat, and I understood it. I didn't agree with it, but I understood. I was like, okay. I was like, yeah, I understood it and I agreed. I was like, okay, I get it, but still.
I would have loved to have seen sort of Sydney battle a little bit more with sort of putting this guy behind bars that she did, because there's that one moment where the reporter sort of kind of questioning her and saying, could it possibly be that you sort of saw the wrong person? Was it like plotted evidence, this and the other? And you see like a moment of doubt in there. And I feel like that reveal at the end could have added like a little bit more weight to sort of her consciousness in terms of sort of her putting away an innocent man that's possibly facing the death sentence, if I remember correctly in the movie. That would have been neat. That's just like a small sort of addition to the story that would have made it a lot more interesting and a lot more sort of satisfying, the sort of the payoff at the end.
So I think at this point she doesn't really have a reason to question Cotton's guilt, right? Like she gave her testimony at the trial, he was convicted. And now there's a reporter here trying to turn it into a story, right? And there's clearly a profit motive here because she wrote this book that is about to be published, and she has every reason to want to make a bigger deal out of this than it really is, because if she does, the book sells more copies. And it's like I didn't really get that from that exchange, right?
It was like more like a face she made of like, it was like a moment in sort of the face acting in which she looked like it could be believable that it wasn't the person that she put behind bars. But again, like you said, in the situation that she's in, she's pretty much convinced, and especially with like everything else that's going on in the background as well, it's sort of it's easy for her to kind of step away from it or look away from it. But it just requires like some small like rewrites of like how the story unfolds in this to add that element in there that would have added sort of another level to the movie for me. But I understand, in the context of this movie, it didn't really make sense for her to really do a bit of a deep dive into actually look into who actually was the real person that murdered their mother.
No, it kind of would have though, if you think about it, because if she did her own little investigation and found out, okay, it wasn't this guy that did it, then that would have crossed him off the list, and now she would have gone on a hunt to find out who actually killed her mother, which could have made the story like added more depth to the story. Even though I don't agree that they should have done that, by the way, because I think if we should just take this film as it is, as in like it's already like low key is already complex enough for a slasher movie in terms of its genre, right? And that was gonna actually lead up to my next question. In terms of like why they shouldn't have gone to that path, I do agree, because I feel like for me it's just like listen, they've already, made the film interesting in terms of like showing like horror movie tropes. My question, which I was gonna ask, do you think people just see this film as another slasher movie, and we are just kind of like seeing this movie from like a filmmaker's perspective in terms of like it being created, like Daniel, what you were saying before, like filmmakers are saying this is a wonderful slasher movie because of X, Y, and Z. So do you think people like the audience reaction to this movie back then and even now is okay, this is just a fun slasher movie known for its kills, or do you think they're seeing it the way that we're seeing it in terms of what's actually going on?
So I think the movie angle is very overt, right? You don't need to like a film studies degree to notice it, right? In the very first scene, they talk about scary movies, and one of the characters is this movie buff who kind of says, okay, if this was a scary movie, this is how, like, this is what the rules would be, and this is the different archetypes that we slot into, and you should never, go into the dark basement alone, and then somebody goes into the dark basement alone, while at the same time, like, doing exactly the sort of thing that we all say we would never do if we really were in a scary movie, and all of this stuff is very obvious, right? I think there's like a ladder where you can take as many steps as you want, right? If you want to take no steps at all, it's just a really well-made, well-functioning slasher movie with fun kills and likable characters, or characters that are unlikable in just the right way, that sort of thing. And you can take one step more and then notice that they're playing with this idea of scary movies. And then you can, and if you've seen all these different classic movies, you can kind of see kind of the illusions or how they're playing with the tropes or all of that stuff, right? So I don't think it's a reach at all. I can only speak from my experience, right? But like this movie is known for doing that, right? It's not just like you don't have to be a massive film buff to kind of notice this. But I think the more you know about movies, the more you notice. And I think that is one of the things that kind of has kept this movie fun for me, is that when I watched it 20 years ago, I noticed almost none of these things. When I watched it 10 years ago, I noticed some of them. And this time watching it for this conversation, I noticed a few more, right? So the more I know about movies, the more I get out of Scream, because it's written by and for people who think that way or who have that kind of background. And so I think it kind of captures like every aspect or every section of the audience in a way, where none of this is essential to have a good time with the movie, but the more of it you recognize, the better a time you have.
Because I was asking, like, I was just trying to like figure out, like, because when I first watched it, I watched it twice. When I first watched it 2 days ago, and then yesterday again. So yeah, so when I watched it first, I just took it as a slasher. But then when I watched it again, I said, okay, I can see kind of like what's going on in terms of why this movie stands out from the others, in terms of the whole, like, they're following the rules of horror movies and they're showing it, and they're kind of like, I don't want to say taking the piss, but it's got like, it's funny because it's got like scary movie vibes. Like in a way, it's like a parody in a way of horror movies, but it's not a parody, if that makes sense, because scary movie, that's a whole like parody. But this movie is like a parody, or a serious parody of horror movies in general, in terms of, just the rules and the ethics of it. So that's why I found it to be interesting. And I was wondering to myself, like, do other people see that as well? And is it this that's keeping the franchise alive? Because when I'm watching, do you think this is what's keeping the franchise alive?
I think I saw 4 years ago,
okay.
And I've not seen 5 and 6. And the reason I've not seen 5 and 6 is that every time I see a discussion of the newer Scream movies, the bottom line seems to be that now it's just a slasher, and it does not really do any of this stuff. And that just makes it less interesting, right? Especially in my mind, I immediately go out on these tangents of, like, this is what you could do with the last 30 years of movies, and of just horror movies specifically, but also all movies. Like, shared cinematic universes didn't exist when this movie was made. And I want to see a movie in this spirit that talks about that, or franchises or reboots about how nothing is new. Like what if there's a Ghostface killer who has to put on the Ghostface mask to be noticed because nobody cares about original killings anymore? You know what I mean? Like there's stuff there. And every time I read or hear something about the new Scream movies, they don't even seem to try to go there. So for that reason, I've not checked them out. And like they are successful in the sense that they are a recognizable brand and they deliver a slasher experience. But I've not been really seen all that many people be all that excited about it, because I think this movie is one of those movies that there's no such thing as a perfect movie in my view, but like every scene in this is essential. I think, like, I don't know what you would cut. There's many characters in this, but I don't know who you would remove. Every aspect of it is deliberate because it wants to do a specific thing and it does that, and every piece of it is in service of that idea. So it's not just let's put some teenagers in precarious situations and then have somebody with a mask kill them. Like there's so much, like there's more going on, and as a result, when we do get the killings, they mean more, right? They're more interesting, they're more engaging, then they're less generic, less interchangeable. And I think if you take out that aspect, like even if you're not conscious of it, I think it feels more disposable. And I don't think Scream is disposable at all.
So you think all the kills in Scream make sense? Because I'll be honest with you, the first kill, I didn't really get it, as in like what it's got to do with Sid's story.
The principal as well. I was questioning his kill as well.
No, the principal I understand. Goes back to my point. Like that's Sid's school, and the principal, someone like the principal that's getting killed, that's pretty much saying, look, man, anyone can get it, number one, and number two, I'm killing the people that you think that I can't kill. Like, do you know what I'm saying? So it's like it's pretty much building up towards her. Is the fear.
So when I say that all scenes are essential, I'm not just talking about like just the motivation of the killer or like the sequence of the plot, but like in terms of there's no filler scenes in here, right? Like they either further the plot or elaborate on a character or they expand on the theme, right? Even the opening scene has the purpose of signaling to the audience what kind of movie this is, right? And if you take out that scene, like the plot itself still works, right? Because that character, Casey, right? The killing of Casey is not strictly essential for the plot, I don't think, but it is essential for the experience of the movie from the audience perspective. So in one way or another, these scenes all accomplish something.
But can't you argue that that's a filler then? Because if that first scene was just done for the experience of the audience.
My point is it's a different kind of movie if you take out that opening scene, right? Because it does not really go towards plot itself, but it goes towards what kind of movie this is and what it signals to the audience. No, this is a movie that's aware of your expectations and it's trying to outsmart you and surprise you. And if you take that out, you get a lot less of that in the movie.
I understand.
And in a bad movie, you have scenes that literally just fill time. They don't accomplish anything like this. They either repeat information you already know, or they just show characters do mundane things. Like if you watch a bad horror movie, how much time is spent on a character just walking down a dark hallway and then walk down another hallway, and then they check their phone and they see they have no signal, and then two scenes later they check it again and they still have no signal. Like that is filler, right? It's filler if it doesn't provide new information to the audience in some way, and that can relate to plot, it can relate to character, it can relate to theme. There are different ways of doing this, or it can accomplish different things, but it has to accomplish something. And so the opening scene accomplishes that. It kind of throws down the gauntlet and says, we are all here because we've seen a bunch of slasher movies, and this is not like the other slasher movies you've seen, and I'm telling you that I know that you know what a slasher movie is, and I'm here to tell you I'm smarter than you, right? Yeah. It's like that's kind of what it does, right?
Yeah.
That's just my point, right? Like that's why that scene has to be there.
I can see it from that.
So as for the scene with the principal, now it's actually, if you research the making of this movie, that scene is actually there because of studio interference, because the studio pointed out that you have a pacing problem if you don't have that scene there, because then too much time happens between two kills. And that turned out to be correct. It's really good for the pacing. I think if you take out that scene, it's just a less good movie and the flows not as well. But I think it also is an escalation in the sense that instead of a teenager, there's no an authority figure, somebody that, like, think back to when you were a student. How did you perceive the principal? Like some kind of superhuman, right? Like untouchable authority figure, right?
Yeah.
Like at least when you were younger. Maybe not in your last year of school, but like earlier, right? Like there's an aura about a principal, and now the principal is dead. That is absolutely an escalation, and it certainly does raise the stakes. And it makes things a lot more serious in a situation in which nobody has been taking it seriously, not the media, not the other students. It comes immediately after a bunch of jerks have been scaring people in ghost face costumes because they think it's a joke. And then the escalation happens, right? So the scene is there because the studio told them to put in another kill. But then, given that they had to do that, they did it in a way that made the story better, in my opinion. So maybe not 100% essential, but it serves a function and it changes how the story unfolds. And therefore, if you take it out, it's a different movie.
Yeah, no, honestly, it makes sense. Because I think it makes sense. Because imagine what that's doing to Sid, that she's hearing that her head teacher just got killed, knowing that she's a victim on his list as well. That builds onto the torment, and that's exactly what the killer's trying to do to her, torment her.
Yeah.
So
it is not superfluous. It's not just another kill, right? There's a little bit more going on, and I think you can argue whether that is really essential or whether it's just my point is just compared with a bad movie, and there's scene after scene where literally nothing happens, right? Like there's no new information, there's no character development, there's no plot development, and just that is not in this movie, right? That's just kind of my point.
I didn't have a serious issue with it too, so I'm kind of be here debating with it. It was just more on the context of how the kills related to the killers and why they would kind of go about killing the principal. Like the context of the scene being there and escalation and stuff like that, all makes sense. It's just the motivational aspect of it was just where I had the question marks.
That is why I don't believe Billy when he says it's about revenge. I think that is toying with the idea of revenge is inherently a good character motivation. It makes sense in a way. We've talked about how it makes sense that Billy wants revenge in some way, right? It's it doesn't make logical sense, but it's kind of on a human level, it's understandable that he blames Sydney for what her mother did, right? It's a thing humans do, right? But then taking the step of putting on a costume and stabbing half a dozen people to death does not follow. Right? I think the entire plot of the movie falls apart if you think it's about personal revenge, because we already know that he can sneak into her bedroom, right? He can just kill her right there. If he knows the father's away for the weekend, he can just come in under the pretense of just wanting to hang out or whatever, and then just stabbing her when she's not paying attention. And that's the movie. Right, but obviously that's not the kind of movie we're watching. And so from a logical standpoint, the idea of this is about personal revenge does not really make sense. I think that's kind of what you're getting at, right?
Yeah, no, exactly that, pretty much.
Yeah, and that is why I think it's more of a commentary about character motivations and what we expect of villains and how we demand a motivation, but we don't really care in many cases and so on, right? So I think that's what that is about.
In my personal opinion, I do care about kind of villain motivations most of the time.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they fall flat on me. But I, again, in the wider context of the movie and the commentary and the discussion that is raising in this, I understand why they inserted it in there, even though it's a little bit of a flimsy excuse as to why he's going around doing the killings that he's actually doing.
You guys don't have any critiques of this film? It's pretty much perfect for you guys. Well, Daniel, for you, because Harvey, did you say you found it to be a fun film, but it was just
yeah, man, I enjoyed it. There's for going into it expecting what I expected and knowing it's not going to be super complex in terms of the storyline and the plot. It's going to kind of follow very much a linear path, and obviously it's going to throw in a few red herrings here and there and stuff like that. I got what I expected going into the movie, and I can't really complain too much about what I got. And there isn't anything that happened in there where I was a bit why did that happen, or not overly questioning why something happened. I mean, the only critique I probably had was who was the second killer? Not Billy Loomis, the second guy.
Stu. Oh, his friend.
Stu. Yeah. He was just a bit over the top sometimes in some of his scenes. He just was too much personality in some of the scenes that he was in. But
did you not know people like that in high school?
Not that obtuse.
Not exactly like this, but kind
not
of
exactly like that. I mean, you can kind of recognize the character of him, but this one was dialed up to 100 pretty much.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I don't really think I've got many negatives about the movie, and I'm trying to think about it. I really don't think there's much negative you can really take away from this movie. I don't know. How about you guys?
I don't think there's such a thing as a perfect movie, but I don't think there's any huge problems with it. It's a very polished, very thoughtful script. it's oozing with talent and skill, right? Like this is like the who's who of like B-list 90s actors, right? Like virtually everybody is somebody you recognize from other stuff if you watched movies in the 90s. I think the ending is supposed to be jarring, right? And in that sense, it does what it's supposed to do. But at the same time, it's also just a really solid slasher movie that I think is more fun than like your typical Halloween or Friday the 13th movie. So for me, it just works on every level it attempts.
Even just like Ghostface as a sort of antagonist in this, it's just like everything that he does is just, it's a little bit fun, to be fair. Like the whole sort of kind of phone conversation and sort of the teasing and the playing with his victims in this. Even some of the more comical aspects of it, when he's like chasing the victims and he's getting like knocked over by certain stuff and whatever, and he's just kind of like being frantic about sort of how he's trying to kill people and whatever. Like all of that is like very enjoyable.
And sometimes you just see him kind of skulking in the bushes, and he looks a little bit silly, but then he bursts out of a closet with the knife and the mask, and he's terrifying, and it's really bloody as well. Like this movie does not really pull any punches in regards to like injury and blood, and like there's lots of gore everywhere, and also the fact that it's like a cheap Halloween costume, right? Like this is not some elaborate character design. This is just literally could be anybody.
I wonder how the reveal of there being two ghost faces felt to some audiences watching it for the first time, because I've watched Scream 6, so I know that, you know, there's kind of almost like a rule of two, you know, in this, where there's like normally like two people that are sort of playing the character of sort of Ghostface, or sort of putting on the mask essentially. So I'm quite curious to know like how people felt like seeing that there was like two killers and like not knowing who to sort of maybe trust in sort of the final scenes of this movie. And I think what it did well as well was sometimes like supernatural elements of, you know, these serial killers, these slashers, where sort of, you know, they're just like doing stuff
Two
or
places
like,
at once and stuff.
that type of stuff. You know, it had like that question throughout the movie as to like how they're sort of like just disappearing and this and the other, and how like people are just like appearing and disappearing and whatever. And then the reveal of there being two people behind it, like actually sort of makes sense in terms of sort of how Ghostface was acting and how he was able to sort of do what he did throughout the whole movie. Because like I'd watched Scream 6, so I knew it, but I wonder sort of if you guys had that fresh reaction to it, or if anyone else had a fresh reaction to it, and sort of know what their experience of it was.
Like I knew it was coming, obviously, but I think the more you watch this movie, you more appreciate how much that does for the movie. Right, so it is the first time you see, like, it's exactly this right kind of twist, where the first time it happens, it's surprising, it comes out of nowhere, and then if you watch it again, it's obvious, and it has to be this way, because the fact that there are two killers is woven into the story on multiple levels, right? They are each other's alibi, right? So if when Billy is in prison, Ghostface appears somewhere else, and so that's his alibi, right?
What I thought was genius about that as well is that you kind of don't know whether he purposely dropped the phone when he went through her window, because they then checked the call logs and it showed that he wasn't the one that was making the calls to any of the victims. So it kind of diverted the attention away from him whilst sort of his media frenzy was going on. But kind of continue.
Yeah, he's drawing the attention of everybody. Meanwhile, Stu can do his thing, right? And there's also, like you mentioned, there's this horror cliche about the teleporting slasher villain, right? Who seemingly always catches up with the victim and is in two places at once. And he is in two places at once, right? Because there's two guys, right? There's a scene where he makes one of the victims guess whether he's at the front door or the back door, and they're at both. One is at each, right? Mm-hmm. So whichever way she chooses, like, he seems like a genius because he anticipated every move, but that's because there's two of them. Right, so it's stuff like this. So stuff that seems like a horror cliche, if as you're watching it for the first time, is actually explained by there being a second killer. Right, so it's stuff like this that when you watch it again, you just start picking up on these little details, and it's all thought through and it all works, right? Like in the grand scheme of things. So I think that is what makes that elevates a good movie to a great movie, is when stuff that seems to not quite work out, or that just seems to be kind of there, actually carries meaning the more you watch it, right? And this movie does that, and I think that's why it deserves to be one of the greats. Yeah. So having said all this, do you think if you watch it again, you would have a different experience, or is this just a solid slasher?
I think I'll definitely pick up on a lot more things the second time around, knowing sort of how the movie plays out, and you have a little more context as to sort of what to look out for in the movie. It's a bit like what you said, is that in terms of like the first time this is the first time I watched it, and it was just like a really good sort of slasher movie, really good popcorn flick, and eventually, because I do think I will watch it again, because again it's just like a nice cozy. I say it's cozy about a slasher movie, but it's got like a nice kind of cozy, familiar feel to it of sort of being sort of a 90s film. But when I do watch it again, I definitely will be paying a lot more close attention to some of the more in-depth stuff that's happening in the background.
Doesn't make it more interesting. So it's not just trivia, right? Like there's actually more going on here, and the thing about them constantly talking about movies is not just a gimmick, right? So does that make the movie more interesting and more rewatchable?
I think if you have a deeper understanding of the slasher movies and the horror movies that come before, because again, my experience is mainly just Halloween. Of course, I know about Freddy, and I know about Jason, I know about some of the other characters, but I feel like it probably adds a little bit more of a level to it if you have seen those other ones that have come before. In my opinion, and it was weird because like I kind of like picked up on it, but I didn't in the movie, because like again in the first phone call, I obviously, because we watched Halloween quite recently, so when they were like talking about it in some of the opening and stuff like that, so I did pick up on it, but I didn't understand the relevance of it, and of course then towards the end of the movie they kind of dialed it up to 100, where you've got this film there that's pretty much overtly sort of explaining slasher movies and horror movies and stuff like that, and then you kind of understand that there is sort of something going on with that in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I might sound a bit contradicting, because even though I did enjoy this movie, I found it to be fun, I don't think it's one of my personal favorite slasher movies. I can acknowledge that it's definitely, like, I understand why it is like definitely one of the favorites and one of the greatest. It's just, I feel like a lot of slasher movies are just meant to be watched once, because it just doesn't feel like it's just like a temporary adrenaline rush, if that makes sense, that you get after you see it the first time. Now, Scream, like I said, it goes a bit in more depth with it. Well, it goes way more in depth with it, with obviously what they're doing. But with this movie, it was fun. It's just I don't know. I wasn't as emotionally engaged and triggered from this movie in comparison to. Well, to be fair, I can't even compare it to any other slasher movie. I don't think there's much slasher movies out there which, are movies which I'd like go back and watch again. I do love slashers, I don't get twisted, but in terms of like what like replay value, I don't think slasher movies have replay value, like in comparison to like just like horror movies or like any other genres. Because I think So for me personally, I don't think I'd watch it again with other people, 100%. But in terms of like on my own initiative, I don't know if I'd watch it again.
All right. So, any other thoughts on Scream?
No, definitely enjoyable. Definitely one that I think people should check out, especially knowing that it's probably one of the better slashers compared to some of the others out there. If you are maybe looking to get into this genre of it, or you're sort of looking for something new to watch, I think definitely Scream isn't a bad shout.
You'll definitely get way more of this Scream in comparison to any other slasher movie, especially the slasher movies today. Like, I think I don't even remember the last slasher movie I watched, but it wasn't too long ago. I think it was like Thanksgiving, and Lord have mercy, Scream. Like, it's so basic that sometimes it's hard to believe that Scream, like when you watch it twice, because I feel like you need to watch it twice, how much like way more complex and in-depth Scream is in comparison to the slasher movies that you see now. So I would recommend it. If you haven't seen it before, definitely watch it. Well, guys, thank you very much for tuning into today's episode. We hope that you enjoyed. But before we leave, Hervé.
Thank you very much to our first 100 subscribers. On to the next 100. Of course, let us know your thoughts on Scream. Is this one of your sort of favorite slashers? Is this a classic in your eyes? Let us know in the comment section down below. And of course, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
Hi, guys. We will catch you next week. Au revoir.
Adios.
Bye-bye.